these monks who walked from Valam on the Finnish border of Russia across all of Siberia to come to Alaska were not trained in missiology. In fact, only one of them had a seminary education, and in those days, seminary was pretty much the equivalent of high school. It wasn't a postdoctoral degree. Only one of them had that kind of learning, but they were peasant people, close to the earth. And you know, the people who live close to the earth have this same sense that life is somehow mysterious and sacred and has to be treated with reverence. And so when the church goes forth in January to bless a river, it makes perfect sense to people who know that life could not exist without that water. You know, it's one of the great tragedies perhaps of our time, and especially now, the 21st century, that our kids don't have this sense of nature. When I grew up, we were living in a city already and we had indoor plumbing, but we knew relatives in the countryside who didn't. And to get water meant going outside and pumping it from the earth itself and filling a bucket and bringing it into the house. And if you wanted warm, hot water, you had to put it on the stove and warm it up. But the physical act of going out and getting the water and bringing it in helped you appreciate the water. Because it took time, energy, and sometimes downright inconvenience to bring it in. Now you expect, in our country at least, to turn on any faucet or water fountain and you'll get water. It's just miraculously there and effortlessly. So you can't appreciate it. This was a dialogue I had just a few days ago with someone. Why are kids today so ungrateful? And my answer was, because they don't know how long it took to get us to the level we now take for granted. We don't tell the story of what it was like in your grandparents' generation to chop the wood to keep the house warm, or what it was like as I grew up in the Depression to know that we had nothing but potatoes and potatoes and potatoes, and we were glad to have those night after night. They've never known poverty. They go to the local grocery store and they see tropical fruits all year. When I grew up, we only had the fruits that were in season. You didn't see watermelons until July. You didn't have strawberries in December, but they come from Chile now, I guess. And our melons can be flown in from Honolulu. So kids expect and think that it's perfectly normal, that everything is instantly and always available, and has always been so. Just a few other modern conveniences we were discussing the other day. I said to my students, almost a decade ago now, that I was taking a case of Pampers with me to Moscow. And they said, well, why would you take Pampers to Moscow? Don't they have Pampers there? And I said, well, actually, they don't. It's something new. You can get it in a few import stores, but they're rather expensive. And the kids said, oh, what do they use then? And when I said cloth diapers, the entire class went, ooh. And what happens when they're soiled? You wash them. Ooh. They have never seen it. But even more astounding to me, about a month ago I was teaching a class and I wanted to show a very old film about Native Alaskans precisely hunting for whale. Now if you want evidence that the animal has to give itself to the hunter, it's the most classic example. Because the whale is about as big as this whole building, weighs dozens of tons, and will feed the entire village for a year. But your boat is only as big as from me to the end of the fireplace. 10, 15 feet long. A skin boat that you have to row to get out to the whale. Now, first of all, the whale can swim faster than you can row. So if the whale just slows down a bit or speeds up a bit, you'll never catch up with him. Secondly, once you catch up with him, you've got this huge creature right in front of your little boat. With the slap of one flipper or the leap, one breaching of the whale, your history. And finally, and it's the most obvious, all the whale has to do is submerge. And you can't coax it to come up. But in the film, this huge creature waits for the Eskimo whaling boats to paddle their way out, and he has to hold still for this. They position themselves right in front of him, and they throw their harpoons with all their might into the forehead of the whale. And one harpoon doesn't kill a whale. He has to receive several of these harpoons and eventually die. And then all this caravan of boats, this whole caravan of boats, tow this huge whale home. It's the most obvious evidence that what they have traditionally believed is in fact at least partially true. The animals give themselves to the human beings. Then the human beings have to treat it appropriately. They have to divide it. They have to share it. They have to use it. But it's a gift. It's always a gift. And then, did the missionaries have to tell the people, you should say grace before meals? Their whole life was a giving of grace for everything they had, right? So, but anyway, I had this old film. It's not that old. It's made in the late 60s, early 70s. But it has never been transferred onto VHS or CDs or any other format. It's still in the, 20-pound reel. And I had to find basically an antique projector, right? To me, it wasn't antique. We had these in Alaska 20 years ago. It was the only form of entertainment we had once a week. A film came in, we had a sheet on a wall, people stood in this makeshift movie theater without seats, they did serve popcorn, and we all watched the Three Stooges, on the screen, on this sheet. I remember, however, in a village once, being a slapstick sort of comedy, one participant, the old gag, shoved a pie in the face of the other. Now, in an American audience, or European audience for that matter, people would have laughed. In this culture, when they threw food in the face of the other person, the entire village went, and there was silence. You see what I'm saying about culture? In my ball game, it's funny. In your ball game, it's a sin. And maybe there's a point there. I'm not saying we should abolish all pie throwing. In our culture, it's a joke. In that culture, it's just wrong. It's completely inappropriate. Human beings don't do that. So I was setting up this reel-to-reel projector, and my students are all school teachers. They teach in elementary, middle, and high schools. And they came into the room, and they walked around this device, and they said, "What is this, Father?" I said, "This is a movie, and this is called a movie projector." They had never seen one. I felt like a character out of Sleeping Beauty with my spinning wheel. It's not that. You see what I'm saying, though? There are stories our children haven't heard. There are tragedies in our family's past and real hardship and difficulty we've never told them about. So if they can't be grateful for what they have, it's because they have nothing to compare it to. We have to help them get out of their beam of light. I'm really concerned about this in our culture, because in America, you see, we get a new culture every 10 years. The way I see the world, born in the late 40s, early 50s, and the way the kids who were born in the late 50s, early 60s, and the way the kids who were born in the 70s or 80s see the world is not the same way of seeing. And the way they understand and play the game of life is not the same ball game. So can we get into someone else's beam of light and see it their way? That's always the missionary task. And then to help those people see some of yours. And what is the missionary task? To bring to the people here what they didn't have but didn't know that they didn't have until you came. And what do you have to say to them? Oh, your idea of you all, the life force and everything, that's what we have that too. But what we have, what you don't have, is we know his name. We have his name. And then you read the epistle to the Colossians. All things exist in him and for him, and in him all things hold together. And you suddenly, now as a Christian, because you know the Eskimo way of seeing, your way of seeing has been enriched. In real mission, this always happens. You get to see things their way, and they teach you, therefore, how to see your old ways in a new way. I wasn't that interested in Maximus the Confessor when I was in seminary. I remember getting a chapter in patristics on him. But when I discovered this concept of logos and logi, the one idea or purpose or reason for the whole thing, In the beginning, translate the Gospel of John, chapter 1, that way. In the beginning was the reason for the whole thing. Or in the beginning was the purpose. In the beginning was the meaning. And the meaning was with God, and the meaning was God. And the meaning became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have beheld his glory. And it's Christ. And then I reread one of my favorite books, but I realized I didn't understand it nearly so well reading it in Pennsylvania as I did reading it in rural Alaska. Because you see, getting into that Eskimo way of seeing, even partially, and then going back and reading the old texts, brought from that other way of seeing into my own a richer and deeper way of understanding it. Toward the end of his classic treatise, For the Life of the World, Father Alexander Schmemann defines a Christian as a person who, wherever he looks, sees Christ and rejoices. Now, I understood that in a kind of flat way in seminary. And now I'm reading it in rural Alaska, and I understand it in a much deeper way. And I don't think Father Alexander would protest that my new way of seeing violated what he meant when he wrote it. Just the opposite. I think my new way of seeing is closer to what he meant than what I got reading it in Pennsylvanian suburbia as a teenager. Now, as an adult in rural Alaska, I read the same text, and it's so much richer than I first realized. But it's true for the way I read the gospel. And I think this is what you can detect in the writings of these missionaries. They come thinking that they have all this new stuff to give to these backward pagan natives. And to some extent, that's true. But they have some things to teach their teachers. And real teachers always learn from their students. And we're all enriched by it. And this is what the monks did. They took the time to hear the stories, and when they presented the Orthodox Christian faith to the native Alaskans, they didn't have to destroy it, annihilate it, attack it, or denigrate it. They picked those parts that were harmonious to the gospel, and they said, now, we have something to add to that. All this was done that it might be fulfilled. And your idea of respect, why would we be against, would we want people to disrespect living things? I don't think so. I am the life of the cosmos. And if you understand it that way, then it's Christ who is the life of everything, not just everyone. And our faith, and especially our sacramental life, is a way of helping people see that way. Get out of your own limited sunbeam and get into God's sunbeam. See the world as Christ sees it. What else is the great blessing of water? The water is already a sacred thing because life depends on it, but we don't see it that way. So we go forth on theophany and we invoke God and the Holy Spirit, and we say, as you used water on all these other occasions, and we've read 15 occasions already, water in the days of the Red Sea, water as the Jordan River crossing into the Promised Land, water as Naaman washing 7 times and being healed, water as a sign of God's power, Elijah dousing his offering so many times, water as Moses floating down the Nile, Noah in his ark, the rock in the wilderness gushing forth water. Water has been used to cleanse, to heal, to bless, to sanctify, to baptize. Now use this water. Can he? Of course. Will he? Yes. So we bless it, not so much so that God will zap it and now it's holy before it wasn't. We say all those prayers to help us see water, not just this water today, but all water as somehow sacred and blessed. Because in the beginning, God saw everything as very good and he blessed it. And we don't experience life that way. We're blind to it. So the church tries to open our eyes to see what was already there, was just like those texts, to understand it in a deeper and richer way. And we can't do it by just teaching a philosophy class. We can't do it by painting a painting. We have to go out with banners on the cross and sing the Troparion and read the prophecies and do it, and then we see. Then we see more widely and more deeply. So the church brought that deeper vision to these people, but they also had something to contribute to us. And that's what shines through in the writings of these monastic saints. And then there's one last monastic. We've covered Father Herman, the most famous of them, Father Macari, the least known of them, the one who was frustrated because he didn't have anybody to baptize. Father Gideon, who came as the Tsar's emissary. Father Yosef, the head of the mission, who wrote the most protests before Father Herman, went back to Russia to report directly to the governor about the terrible conditions in Kodiak, was appointed Bishop of Kodiak, the only person who ever had that title, and given authority to put the house in order. But the ship bringing him back sank. And the regime lasted another 19 years. So that's when Father Herman sort of gave up and moved away. And then we have one last one, the only other priest monk in the delegation, Father Juvenali. And I brought him last because we have very little information. I think that all these things that I've just said was true about the way he saw his work, because he spent several years among Native Alaskans as he gradually made his way across about half the state, half the territory. He was sent by a ship to Yakutat, way over on the east side, and he worked his way through what is now Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound across to the Bering Sea, pretty much the whole width of mainland Alaska in his 2 or 3 years of missionary journeys. He left Kodiak, as I said, on a boat, very frustrated that the Kodiak language was very difficult. And then, crossing all these mountains, 50 years later, an American historian in San Francisco claims to have found Father Juvenali's personal journal, personal diary. Now, when I first heard about someone in San Francisco having this journal of a monk from 1798, I thought that was a bit strange. Apparently, American historians didn't think it was strange. Why couldn't a monk keep a diary? Well, but if you're Orthodox, why would a monk keep a diary? Dear diary, today my abbot was nasty to me and I feel really bad about it. It's not the kind of thing a monk would write, right? And remember, and this is why I mentioned it earlier, Father Herman, when asked, can you prove statistically how many people perished, he said, we weren't given paper and ink to give out baptismal certificates. So why would a monk, first of all, it's preposterous to be keeping a personal journal, but why would he waste his paper and ink on such a project when there are much more important things to record and report? So I've always considered this journal in San Francisco a bit suspicious. And about 15 years ago, I went down to check it out, and there was no Russian original. That also makes it suspicious. Father Juvenali's English translation was there, and there was an explanation that the Russian original was borrowed, and this English translation was made, and then the original had to be given back to its owners, who live in Alaska. Well, there's no such family in Alaska. The family name doesn't exist. And when you open this supposed journal of Father Juvenali, he sails on ships that very obviously didn't exist either. I mentioned earlier that the ship that first came to Alaska, the Three Hierarchs, it had a feast day, just like a church would have a feast day. Three Hierarchs, end of January, there's a feast every year. And the sailors on that ship, you can be sure, when that feast day came, the feast day of their ship rather than their parish, they had a holiday. They had the day off and a couple extra swigs of vodka, guaranteed. And the companionship was Simeon and Anna. Well, you know when that feast is, the day after the presentation of the Lord into the temple, 41 days after Christmas. We know this. Any Orthodox Christian would know. So if it's the ship named the Adrian and the Natalia, we know when that feast is. But this guy was sailing on a ship named the Adrian and Anastasia. There's no such feast day. Consequently, we know without even looking in the records, there's no such ship. Someone was making this up. Then you have him come to the Eskimo part of Alaska, and he learns the language in a matter of weeks. He says it's real easy. But the Eskimo language in that region and the language on Kodiak Island are about 85% identical in structure and in vocabulary. So again, it doesn't add up. On every page of this supposed journal, I found such glaring mistakes that I could prove to anybody with an open mind that the journal was bogus, a fiction. Now, why is that so important? Because the first stories about Alaska, the first history in English, included this journal. And in this journal, Father Juvenali confesses to being seduced by an Indian princess. So it's a typical Victorian melodrama where the priest falls into sin. And he's busy confessing this, by the way, in writing, "Dear journal, I feel really bad about sleeping with that woman last night." When in fact, the Indians rush into his quarters and murder him for refusing to marry her. Now, this is the tall tale that has circulated in all our history books in Alaska about Father Juvenali for almost 200 years. And it's slander, basically. So I set out informally about 15 years, 20 years ago, to find out what really happened to Father Juvenali. And fortunately, my first parish included this entire region that he passed through. So I, not suspecting that the journal was a phony, I went to the Indian village where this supposedly happened, and I basically said to my parishioners, "Okay, where did your ancestors bump off my predecessor?" And they said, "Out there in the middle of the lake on that rock, we call that Monk Rock." But I looked at this rock. It was a houndstooth shape. There was no way to climb up on it. And I realized that they were doing something typically Athabascan, typically American Indian. They were saying, "That's the preposterous story we're going to tell you, and if you're dumb enough to believe it, then go ahead." So I looked at that rock and I said, "That's impossible. No one could climb out of a boat to get up onto it. It's just sheer cliffs all the way around." They said, "Yeah, we know." But that's what we tell all the white guys who ask. "Well, what's your real story then?" And they said, "He went that away." And in that whole region, he went that away, he went that away. And then, I kind of gave up. Then I came across some notations from later missionaries that when they went through a particular village on the Bering Sea, 3 or 4 different priests, Orthodox priests, write in their journal, "When we come to the village of Quinahawk, this is the place Father Juvenali died." Now, this is hundreds of miles further west. But he could have got that far, who knows? But no further details. But one, for example, in 1838, and another one in 1845, and another one in 1862, and another one in 1873. As they pass through that village, they all say, independent one from the other, "This is where Father Juvenali died." So, okay, there's some indication. Then my father-in-law, blessed memory, our starosta, Adam, he told me one day, "I have a story to tell you. I want to tell you about the first priest to come into our region." At this point, I didn't even think about Father Juvenali. I thought about Father St. Yakov Netsviatov, who came in 1842 and spent 18 years among the Eskimo people and died in retirement at Sitka. But his story was nothing like that. He said the first priest came along the Bering Sea coast in a little boat. In Yupik, the word is Agniatjoch. Agniatjoch is not a kayak. It's an open boat of some sort, maybe a canoe, but not an Eskimo-style boat. That's the important point. And he approached a hunting party in which there was a shaman, a medicine man. And as he approached, the shaman told the other hunters, "Try to get him to turn back." And the guys, I suppose, stood up and started going, "Get out of here." But they continued to come, rowing the boat. The shaman said, "Raise your arrows." And they all put up their arrows and pointed them in his direction. That should have been intimidating enough, but the boat kept coming. So the shaman said, "Shoot him." And they fired their arrows and killed the priest, who fell into the bottom of the boat, dead. He had, however, a servant, a chanter. That's the word, actually, that they use in this story. Nagista means saltiros, someone who chants the responses at the service, a shtets in Russian. He left Kodiak alone, but somehow he picked up somebody along the way, probably as a guide also to show him the path through the mountains, down the rivers and such. This man, whoever he was, tried to escape by jumping overboard and swimming away. Now, there's no tradition among Yupik Eskimos of swimming. People will go wading nowadays, but historically they didn't have any tradition of swimming. The water's just too cold. Hypothermia sets in really quick. So you don't go swimming as a sport, and certainly not out in the ocean where it's always cold, the Bering Sea. So the hunters were astounded at this man's ability to swim so well. They, however, got into their kayaks, chased him, and eventually killed him as well. He swam, they said, however, diving and coming up for air like a seal. Then back to the boat, they dragged Father Juvenali's canoe, or Angyachok, a little boat, ashore, and the shaman removed his cross. It was a brass pectoral cross. He tried to do some kind of magic, but it wouldn't work. And he tried again, and it wouldn't work. And he tried again, and it wouldn't work. And finally, in frustration, the shaman removed this cross, tossed it aside, and said, I don't know what this is, but there's power here I don't want to deal with. And that was the end of my father-in-law's story about the first priest. No, that can't be true. Father Yaakov died in... Oh, he might be talking about Father Juvenali. Then, wow, it hit me. So how can we corroborate this? 15 years later, just a few years ago, a colleague of mine was doing research in the history of the Protestant missions in Western Alaska, and specifically in the Moravian Church archives. Remember Moravia? Rostislav's home country. The Moravian Church in the United States and in Moravia was the first Protestant movement before Luther, almost 100 years before Luther. And their desire was relatively simple. They wanted to reform the church by having the Bible in their own language and receiving Holy Communion, both the cup as well as the sanctified bread. Those were the two things they were demanding from Rome. Of course, they got burned at the stake for this, but you see how orthodox they were. They were asking for a reform that was in complete harmony with orthodoxy at the time. In any case, they wound up sending missionaries to Alaska from their headquarters in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Moravians came to the United States and they formed settlements, and they named them all after biblical towns. Bethlehem, Nazareth. I was raised in Emmaus. The oldest church in Emmaus is, of course, the Moravian church. And last week I was in a place called Egypt, which is, I guess, where you run when you're tired of Bethlehem. You go... But in any case, I'm familiar with this church, and this woman said, I'm doing research in the Moravian Church archives, and I came across this passage, and she copied it out and sent it to me. An American Indian who was converted to Christianity and a Moravian Protestant missionary to the village of Quinahawk in 1895 wrote a report saying, apparently I'm not the first missionary to come here. And this is in his journal, written down, so we can believe it. Because we only believe in our culture what's in writing. That's part of our way of seeing. If people only say it, it might not be true. That's a different way of seeing. But here's the guy, now we have it in writing. The guy says, I'm not the first missionary to come here. Long before me, a Russian priest came along this shore in a little boat. He met a shaman and a hunting party who tried to prevent him from landing, and when he continued his approach, they killed him in a hail of arrows. His servant, that's what he called him, his assistant, jumped overboard and tried to swim away like a seal. It's almost verbatim my father-in-law's report. It was written down 100 years before I heard the story, but 100 years after the actual event. You say 100 years, that's awfully long. But in a culture filled with, that does everything by oral tradition, it's really not that long. You have a 15-year-old boy who witnesses this martyrdom in 1799. He lives another 40 years. That brings you up to 1840. And he tells this story to his grandson, who's 10 years old in 1840, and lives 50 more years. The grandson tells the missionary, you're one eyewitness away. It's not that long. And to find the report another 100 years later, exactly in the same words, is not so surprising either. This is how the gospel was originally preached, after all. It wasn't written down, but it was preserved by the community. You can't retell the story and get it wrong because someone in the audience will say, that's not right, you missed this part. The way your 4-year-old does when you try to go fast forward in the bedtime story. They don't let you get away with it. Huh? You're not telling it right, Grandpa. Go back and do that part again. Oh, all right. They caught you, right? But that's how it is in an oral tradition. People know the story, and they're not going to let you monkey with it at all, tamper with it at all. So I became convinced that the oral tradition was really accurate. Father Juvenali, also a member of the first monastic mission to America, went to the mainland, converted people, baptized people. In his wake, there are Orthodox villages. Wherever he went, he planted the Orthodox Christian faith, and the people in that path are still Orthodox to this day. So he must have done a pretty good job. He got into their beam of light. What he said made sense. And then he was killed by these people on the Bering Sea. Why didn't they receive him? Why were they so hostile? And that was the last piece that I hope to personally to verify, also visiting here in the Washington, D.C. area at the Smithsonian. I saw only 2 pictures of such a thing, but in an exhibit and then in a book, over 20 years ago now, there was a display of chains carved in walrus ivory, and the placard or the description under the photo said, the caption said, "Shamans in Alaska carved ivory chains in imitation of shamans in Siberia who wore metal chains as a sign of their rank and distinct status as shamans." So what did those Eskimo hunters think when they saw this tall guy in a cassock approaching their camp with this cross? It seems as a case of intercultural misunderstanding. They understood him according to their way of seeing. And according to their way of seeing, he was an alien, intruding shaman with powers they didn't want to deal with. How can you defend yourself from the magic or powers of a shaman from the other side of the Bering Sea? You try to get him to go back.